Thank you, Crash. It was really interesting listening to my fellow panelists. I didn't realize how well aligned we would be, considering we hadn't actually had a conversation about smart cities. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, as shaping it up through the lens of maybe a technologist, is some of the words I picked up in the other presentations, which is around this new wave of how we're redefining what it means to be a smart city and how we're using technology as a tool. So a little bit about myself, just to help anchor the lens and the approach that I'm taking to this. I have two technology companies. One's a services-based one, and the other one is an impact investing platform that collects and manages data for impact investments. And then also my background is a little bit eclectic. So I'm formally trained in social innovation, have experience in my work background, social innovation. I studied governance and policy structures and would have considered myself at one point a policy wonk. And then, of course, I have the two technology companies now. And so the approach that I'm taking to the conversation today, or looking at smart cities, is definitely one that sits at the intersection of those three areas of expertise. And so I started thinking, and when Karash invited me to speak, I didn't see it as an obvious fit right away because I'm not an urban planner. But I did start to think about, how we've defined traditionally what it means for a city to be smart. And the things that we think about are Internet of Things, smart grid technology, energy efficiency, mobility, access to Wi-Fi across the city. And as I started thinking through those things, I thought about a book I had read called Oryx and Crake, the first book of a trilogy of a series of Margaret Atwood books. Has anyone read Oryx and Crake? Okay, a few of you. So you're probably thinking, okay, why is she talking about Oryx and Crake? It's definitely futuristic, and I'll leave the narrative aside. But if you're, as the reader, paying attention to the backdrop of which the novel is telling a story alongside, is you end up with exactly the type of cities that you envision as futuristic. You see cities that are interconnected. There's high connectivity using technology. There's automation. There's efficiencies of service deliveries. There's flying cars. But what's also highlighted within the novels, when there's been advances within technology and sciences, is that there was also environmental ruin, and there was mass poverty, and new class structures were created. Now, I'm by no means saying that if we focus on just advances within technology for technology's sake, that that's where we'll end up. But it does raise the question of how we think about our cities and the cities that we live in. And so I'd like to challenge us today and on the panel to think about, how do we define smart cities? Rather think about how we build cities of the future that are smart, and how we define our cities of the future as smart will become critical to building successful futuristic cities. So, how do we define then what becomes smart future cities? And if I look at that cross-section of experience, the few things that I can pull out on, and I did hear it from the other panelists, is using an approach of human-centered design. And so at the core of being able to design really great services, technology, or policy is always ensuring that the end user is at the forefront, but also that it's human focused, that those services and the technology is being delivered and developed by and for those individuals. And the way that one of the really unique features of human-centered design is this idea around observation. And so, traditionally how we've collected information from citizenry has been on consultation and town halls and interviews, and there will be a subset of people who show up and who want to give voice to whatever the issue is that's being questioned or raised. But within human-centered design, there is this one piece of methodology that's quite special around observation. And so the idea is that not only do you employ empathy and put yourself into a specific user's journey or their own shoes, but rather that you put yourself in positions where you can observe individuals who are struggling with a particular challenge with the lens of looking at potential solutions. It's also governed by this idea of the 80-20 law. So you spend 80% of your time understanding the problem, getting really well versed in the problem that you're trying to solve, and the 20% remaining focused on what that solution will be. The other thing around like this idea of product development and using human-centered design is also, at the end, your solution, it may or may not be technical in nature, but it likely can be enabled or scaled or accelerated if you can employ technology, and not in every instance. But what we do want to make sure that we avoid is that we're just building cool features within our cities because it's a neat thing to do. And so when we're using human-centered design and that approach, it means that what's actually going to end up happening is if we're focusing on the people and this very specific problems of those people in those communities, that every smart city is going to look different. And every community is going to come up with new ways by which they can employ technology to address some of those challenges. So example, 15 to 20 years ago when Estonia was rebuilding their community and they were behind, they thought, how are we going to catch up? And their solution was to leapfrog. And so they said, great, we are going to digitize all of our governance services and infrastructure. And that's how Estonia solved the problem of being behind. In Japan, as another example, the people problem that they were focused on was that they had really high suicide rates in their undergrounds. And so the technology or the solution that they decided to employ was the blue light. And so now there's the blue light in some of their undergrounds, and it's reduced the number of suicides of individuals who have jumped onto the tracks. So those are people-focused solutions that are enabled by technology, and they're not all going to be the same for every community or every city. And so that's the second point that I wanted to highlight, is that we're not going to be able to implement solutions in one city and be able to always pick them up and that they fit another city. And arguably, that would be the case for the segments within our society. As we're building very specific solutions for end users, our end users are going to have different needs. And what that means is, we may be building different services or tools for different segments of the population, and that's okay. We don't need to be building necessarily services that meet the average where they're at, because according to this room, if this was the average, it's certainly not representative of the types of services that are needed in our community. So I think really just, it's about getting comfortable with building for outliers and extreme cases and recognizing that those will be the case, and they have to be part of how we build smart societies going forward. And then the other thing that I did want to touch on is just this concept around long term. So as we build smart cities, we talk about technology as it's really fast and it accelerates and it's happening at a faster pace, and all of that is true. And that's the role that governments, and citizens play through the policy making, and just ensuring that as we build our cities for the future, that it's coming from a place of vision, and that vision has the collective experience in it with a long-term benefit and gain. Because oftentimes the solutions that we'll build, you can do a really quick cost-benefit analysis on it, and if the payoff isn't immediate, at some times, and this is where I know on the panel we'll talk about the tension between public-private sector leadership within this space, but oftentimes this is where private sector may not be able to lead. The public sector would definitely have a longer term vision, and there's not always going to be the immediate quick trade-offs or even economic or people impact immediately. So just making sure that we're thinking about the investments that we make long term. They are expensive investments. It does require infrastructure, and that cost benefit analysis might not prove valuable from an economic standpoint for 10 years from now. And so simply in closing, before I join my other panelists, smart cities of the future will be defined by connected communities that are efficient in solving problems and in the service delivery. Technology is not the solution, rather it is the tool that will enable the solutions for our cities in the future. Thank you.